because just a couple months ago, Catherine and I participated in a one-week training that was coordinated by the African Development Bank, and it was centered around value for money in health and education. And it was basically about health system strengthening, and but clearly this was what worked in selling it to the ministers of health, education, and finance.
Well, finance was interested in going to Harvard, so.
Comments? Anne LaFon from JSI. Building on that, what are the sellers in terms of metrics? I mean, you're looking at the link between evidence and health, HSS evidence and health outcomes. What are the other metrics that you're looking at? What are you finding?
I don't really work in the metrics section of what we're doing. I'm more on we have someone who's evaluation, who's all measurement and metrics, and we have these indicators, I guess, that he's working on. I haven't seen them recently, but he's been working on a set of indicators. But I think that our project, and maybe Catherine wants to talk about the history of measurement, and you might want to even talk about the health system assessment activity, if that's relevant. But there's been a lot of work in the past on indicators that we now have someone in this office who's able to, I think, interact better with the project than we've had in the past, because we didn't really have anyone before. So I think Catherine might be able to give you a better response than I could.
I would say that first it's useful to distinguish between metrics for health system performance and how to measure someone's attempt to strengthen a health system. And the USA published something called the Health Systems Assessment Manual or methodology, and it's full of, and for better or for worse, it is following the building blocks. And so it presents a bunch of indicators for the performance of the health system along those 6 areas. Then separately, and more recently, we have developed, the HFG project did develop a set of measures that are trying to measure the impact of a project that's in a country to improve, to strengthen the health system. So how do you judge whether that project's efforts to strengthen the system are whether they're succeeding or not? And that's on our website. So I think, and a lot of times I think people speak of those things completely, interchangeably.
I wanted to come back to something Abdo said about the control knobs and sort of what you're looking at. It's really fascinating because, as I said, the building blocks, and particularly just those static blocks rather than the interactions, really have had a big influence at USAID. But what's really interesting is that the World Bank flagship course is hugely popular, not only with USAID staff and headquarters, but we now have regional workshops that we've been working with the bank on and doing that our field mission people go to. I think it will be very interesting to see over time, because I think this is a kind of a horizon thing, how that sort of influences the thinking that happens at USAID. How long will the building block sort of mentality continue to dominate, and to what extent will this whole new cadre of people who are being exposed to alternative ways of thinking about system, and particularly the results, as you mentioned, how might that influence the way we go about our business? I think it's going to be very interesting to see, because almost every week another one of our regions is sponsoring a flagship course in Asia and another one somewhere else, and I'm like, wow, we're really having a lot of people go through those courses. It'll be very interesting to see what that impact might be.
That's great. Very good. Very good to hear.
Question that sort of builds on Heidi's when she was talking about, first introduction, I'm April Williamson from Results for Development. So Heidi was talking about how to know what to do with funds even if they are there. And my question I think also relates somewhat to your introduction, April, when you were talking about the fact that health systems experts come from varied backgrounds. I guess my question is for the many health systems experts in the room, what really makes a person, an individual, or an organization capable of doing health system strengthening well, given the sort of complexity of the task?
So it's good. Let Abdo talk about the bank.
or Abdo. I think that's a
Since
good.
we can't define it, anybody can.
No, I
think
think, yeah.
Derek should answer. I mean, in some ways you can think that health systems people are born and not made, but that's a sort of, defeating kind of way of thinking about it. And so the question is, how do you get people to think in systems, in the systems thinking approach?
I would actually, somebody was saying, I think maybe it was you, Isabel, you were talking about the public health functions. And actually there was also some work, I think, was it funded by the National Institute of Health in the US, really trying to lay out in a much more coherent basis, sort of like how to analyze the public health system within a broader health system, and actually getting exactly the point you were making, which is that there's a lot of really important parts of the health system that aren't about healthcare and they aren't about health products. And they were sort of saying we're going to call that the public health system. It has a lot of very distinct issues that cause it to underperform, and it has a lot of distinct strategies that have been established to strengthen, whatever is, the particular constraint that's causing it to sort of underperform. Whereas healthcare and health product delivery have some very different sort of mechanics, and would actually require somebody to have a different sort of knowledge domain, expertise, if they were going to really be a very useful sort of technical advisor on health system strengthening. You'd want a different set of knowledge and a different set of experience. But until I found that thing on the National Institute of Health side, I'd never seen anybody who'd actually gone through and said, well, what would a public health systems expert need to know? Like, they would need to know this. And I've never seen anybody, to the contrary, say, well, okay, if somebody was good, what would a real healthcare and health product part of the system really need to know? I think it'd be worth, at least writing it down, if for nothing else, just to have everybody, say what's wrong with it. But I can say that from having been in discussions of it, it's certainly not the case that everybody really knows or agrees. We can at least say that.
Yeah, I'd say there are kind of two ways to answer your question. One is sort of the way people think about things, so sort of from an analytic perspective. And they talk about systems thinking, so that's the idea that stuff is connected in complicated ways, the way things happen are not immediately predictable, so the sort of the linearity and the idea that's behind the logical framework that AID and many donors use sort of says, well, you've got an outcome and you can work backwards from the steps that will get you there. Systems thinking says you can't really do that because the connections and the interactions that happen as a function of people in a system making their own decisions and adapting, it's the interactions that produce the outcome, not the fact that you've identified some kind of causal chain. And Joe mentioned this community of practice. PPL is kind of leading this, and on the Global Development Lab, you can find tons of the presentations that have been made. Some of them are quite interesting. There's an interesting paper called Complexity-Aware Monitoring that I think is quite helpful in terms of thinking about how you might look at measurement of some of these things. Now, on the operational side, one of the papers that I really like is written by a social scientist, anthropologist, I believe, who is a former DFID person. Her name is Rosalind Eden. And she's written a paper essentially saying that the way that people in these bureaucracies do the kind of work that we're talking about in terms of system strengthening is they lie to their bosses. And then they do what they want. So the clever packaging of what you are doing in the terminology of the agency is one way to do it. And this came up in the interviews to the paper that I did along with David. When we asked people, well, how is systems thinking operationalized in the agency? And many of the answers people said, well, we do it, but we describe it in the old terminology so that people feel comfortable. Sort of like what Abdu was saying. You're not saying that you're doing something that's uncertain. No, you say, well, we're adapting and we're doing all this kind of nifty stuff. But it's all very comforting because we use the bureaucratic terminology to do it. And I think that also works as, I think an important point that Abdu made is that often gets sort of short shrift is the perspective that our counterparts in the countries take to these kinds of things. And I think one of the biggest barriers, and it relates to the reform stuff, is that people in the countries are afraid of these kinds of changes. They can't go to their constituencies and say, we don't know what we're doing. We're looking for some kind of emergent and uncertain outcome that will be knowable in 5 years. No, that's simply not going to fly. But I think one of the difficulties, and AID and the rest of the donor community have bought into that, is the whole Busan stuff. Oh, it's country ownership, where they're going to do all these things on their own, and we're going to support them. But if you look at things like PEPFAR 3.0, people are worried. What's going to actually happen when we say, okay, country X, it's now your responsibility to do all this stuff. We're going to use your systems. It's going to be your money. It's going to be your health workers, all that stuff. That's pretty worrisome when you think about AID still, and the USG, I mean, PEPFAR's not just USAID, is still, sort of responsible for some set of results. So I think that's an interesting other aspect to the whole sort of health system strengthening thing, is that there's this whole sort of global discourse around country ownership, country-led development, and all that. That I think is a complicating factor.
I think that's interesting, and I want to just go back to the original question a little bit. Is I don't feel like there's only one kind of person or one view that's capable of doing it. I think the goal is, I think it goes back to Joel's comment. There are some institutional barriers. When you have a 2-year horizon, it's hard to do it. When you have to sell, when you as a politician have to sell it to the general public, it makes it hard to do it. And I think, so maybe one other thing that we, people working in health reform have been doing a long time is to say, it's really important to have a champion on the ground. You need someone who's really going to see it through. That's what's going to make it work. It's like Obamacare. He pushed it through. It's going to stick. And they'll work it out.
So I guess I'm wondering, do people think that universal health coverage could be a vehicle for this idea, or for health system strengthening, or not? And I'm asking you too, whether that terminology
Officially, the World Bank
could be useful.
We want two answers. We want two answers. We want the World Bank answer, and then we would like to hear the Abdo on vacation answer.
So I use the Adam Wagstaff response. If you define universal health coverage as was well defined by WHO, the Q, which is not unique to WHO, many have thought about it before. It has 3 dimensions. It's about increasing access to basic services to those who don't have them now, which typically are the poor and socially vulnerable. We are 100% for that. The second dimension, decreasing out-of-pocket spending, which minimizes the financial barriers from people getting access to life-saving services. We are 100% behind that. The idea is to increase prepayment mechanisms. These are 2 fantastic things. The third one is an upper middle income dimension, which is to increase the package of services. And that's up to countries as they reach out. What is amazing about this WHO construct, it's the first time anybody who's a global health person or group introduces the concept of choice within a limited, constrained environment. It's as if an economist worked on it. Because it basically says, with your resources, you cannot push in all 3 directions at the same time. So as such, I fully agree, it's a fantastic framework. Where I dislike it passionately is that this clarity is never discussed. And so it becomes yet another health system strengthening where people will define it as they are. Half of my clients in Eastern and Southern Africa have defined it as building social health insurance. Oh my God. Yeah. When in Ethiopia, the formal sector is 11% of the economy, setting up a social health insurance is a disaster waiting to happen. But it's defined as a way to achieve universal health coverage. That's where UHC becomes a fantastic headache. The World Bank didn't say this. It's just
some guy
Person on
walking by.
Guy in a t-shirt.
In a t-shirt, yeah.
I think that sums it up pretty nicely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I ask the authors, if you were going to reissue the paper with the next chapter, what would you focus on?
Good question.
That is too hard. I'm gonna
Sorry.
pass it on.
Dump it on the other guy.
Well, I think there has been some progress on understanding how health systems strengthening efforts are contributing to the kinds of results that the support community or the vertical program committee cares about. And it's important that they have a very legitimate question. You know, they're asking a very legitimate question, and people that believe in strengthening health systems care as much about those results as they do, but we just feel like that attending to the larger system is critical for them even achieving those short-term results, let alone sustaining them after everybody leaves. So I think there's been some progress there. And in fact, I think the USAID's, the Office of Health Systems, marshaling the evidence, will be coming out with some of that soon.
Mhm.
So it's combining the support and the strengthening in one package.
No, it's actually looking at health system strengthening activities, and there's been some research done, some studies that have been done that show how they're contributing, that have measured actually changes in service utilization or service coverage or other intermediate indicators that are associated with people's changes in health stats. So
I think it'd be interesting to kind of pursue this line of thinking that Abdo brought up about terminology and how that can or doesn't help the cause of getting people to think broadly and think about all of the interactions. I mean, we've gone from health reform to health systems strengthening, and now we have systems thinking becoming another kind of bubble of thought, and then we have resilience and then health resilience and so forth and so on. And a lot of them very vague concepts. I mean, they have definitions, but do we understand them? Have people really dissected them? So I think that there could be a lot of discussion and thinking about the various ways that we get around describing what we want to talk about and what we want to have happen. And the reality is that, there is this huge educational need for everybody to broaden their thinking in order to be able to grasp and understand what really needs to be done if we want to have real health development, sustainable, and maintained over a period of time. So there's a lot of systems thinking that needs to be done, and I think a lot more that we could delve into.
May I suggest an alternative? Use a country typology approach. For some context, all you can do is what you guys call support.
Right.
And that should be accepted as what is needed now, and there's no real issue. In some context, we need to take it one notch up and think about the reform or strengthening, as you want to do it, and walk people through the implications of doing one versus the other. I think it would be good to have that, because there's a lot of evidence floating around about what comes out when you do one thing or the other. I think that would be a fantastic way. The idea is not to say one is bad and the other is better, it's to say we need to pick the right instrument for the right context.
Sort of along those lines, Joe, you're probably familiar with this, the Global Health Office did a systems workshop, and they took the local solutions paper, that AID has a policy paper that has a set of sort of criteria that you're supposed to use, and mapped them across systems that they thought were weak, sort of medium, and then strong. Have you seen this?
No,
graphic?
I'm not aware of that.
I want that graphic.
Okay, I've got a hard copy, I don't have the other one, but, yeah, Chip Walker will have it. But it's actually quite interesting, because it kind of does what you're saying, Abdul. So it says, well, you're thinking about, what do they call the 5 R's or something like that in the local solutions paper. And the health office, this was last fall. Karen was at it, so she can probably give it to you too. But it's an interesting way of trying to, sort of map some of these systems concepts onto the health system and think about, well, what might you do for addressing these issues?
I think that, just to comment on Abdo's latest comment, I think that's right. I mean, the country topology is critical. The problem is it requires a great deal of knowledge and humility. Who are the people that are going to be able to give advice? To understand and know the different stages and what works then, and how how do you stage this whole process? And goes back to the question of so who are the people? Where are they? And what are their qualifications, as April brought up at the beginning? So it's a challenge to us all.
But that's always been one of the criticisms of the building blocks.
So if you're looking for humility, don't come to the bank.
It might be
Not to be
interesting
found.
for the next paper to look at the evolution of health systems and recognize that even wealthy countries made very pivotal, possibly mistakes or really smart choices as they got richer, and those decision points leave them, in a very good position or in a very much more difficult position to then introduce reforms. And the United States is the poster child of this, right? We just decades and decades of the problems staring us in the face, and we just paralyzed, to deal with it. So so if a country's a lower middle income country, what should it maybe think about today, like major choices it faces today, so it doesn't end up in the same
Politics.
Exactly.
Broken politics.
Because, and this is a point that Ariel makes frequently, at a certain size, dollar value size of the health sector, there's just so much money at stake now. Your political maneuvering ability just keeps shrinking.
The stakes are too high.
Yeah, yeah. And you've lost the chance to be, a Northern European poster child, and you're stuck.
So we just need historians to be health
Yeah.
historians.
It's a fantastic paper by, I think, CGD and Results for Development, looking at the history of universal health coverage in Japan.
Bill Savadoff.
Bill Savadoff,
Yep.
yes, fantastic paper,
Yep.
looking at the historic context as to how Japan, Chile, Sweden, and a fourth country I can't remember right now, got to universal health coverage, and the mistakes along the way, and the luck along the way that got them there. I think April once convinced me that historians are probably more important in terms of understanding the general direction of any health sector reform than economists, which I found unacceptable.
Economic historians is what I meant.
Speaking of literature, Hopkins, the School of Public Health, has been doing some really interesting stuff on systems concepts in health. So David Peters and Ligia, who used to work on HS 2020 way back when she was in AID, Ligia Pena, who got her PhD there, has been doing a lot of good stuff on that.
There was a special issue, right? And,
Yeah, they did a special issue.
all their papers were published together, yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, Abdo, maybe this notion of the country topology, I see it necessary for UHC now in the way that you just described. And it sounds like that paper that you just mentioned with the 4 different countries is one way of looking at it. But has anybody done for UHC what you said would be useful for this health system, health support, health system strengthening, health system support?
I'm not aware of it.
Yeah.
That's why I thought maybe they'd want to think about it.
Yeah.
I think it would be helpful.
I've always thought, I did a secondment from the bank last year with the Gates Foundation, and they were looking, I mean, basically developing a strategy also to sort of build up some work in this area of sort of system strengthening, because most of what they do would certainly would fall under the support, side of things. And this is more what I thought, not that the Gates Foundation thought this, but it struck me that one of the sort of the things holding us back, and that would always almost, make it impossible to make headway on some of these things, is information about, in a way, like the system sort of structure and capacity. Because, we have, thanks to USAID mainly, that we have the DHS, and we therefore can track stuff with the households, what's happening with households, it's comparable over time, and health, we can get information from that. But we don't really have any information that's comparable and tracked over time about any of the sort of the system features that
Right.
you would be trying to change. Now, so then it means that without really ever acknowledging it, it means that we're forcing ourselves to judge how well a health system strengthening initiative is going by virtue of what's been its impact on health. And the time horizons just do not work. Well, first of all, they don't work, and then plus, you might never even really be able to prove a connection between, right? So unless you're going to be able to track something upstream from that, it's like, I think we're always going to have some sort of unsellable. And when are they going to see a health impact from Obamacare? Right? If they were that was their measure, then for sure, well, look, they've already failed because look how long the time has gone by, right? And so it struck me that there's a real measurement thing that's like right in the it's like you said, there's a big rock. Well, like right before the big rock, there's like a big lump, and it's about measurement. And I remember talking to the people at the Center for Studying Health Systems Change, how they develop their metrics and for doing this. Basically what they do is they go out and they sort of do snapshots every 3 years.